Thank you, Riggs, Dr. Klecker, for that very kind invitation. And also I'd like to thank, too, Dr. Susan Helms as well, fellow Cornellian that goes back a few years. She tells me that she was in my class, I won't say how many years ago, but a few years ago. So it's, I think I had an inside track to get the opportunity to come here and speak. And so also I want to thank all of you, good turnout, for coming and listening to this topic. It's a topic that I'm enthused about, have been enthused about for a long time. My career actually started, in a sense, with my graduate studies on diet and health. Now, how many years ago? I hate to say this, 58 years ago, so I've been around for a while. But the idea that I was working with at that time, my prejudice, my beliefs, at that time, what turned out actually to be rather different than what I'm going to tell you today. And the idea that I have now, and that was expressed in the book, The China Study, represents much of our own work over that long period of time, is based on actually the evidence, really the evidence. I came from a different planet, in a sense, with this idea, and it was actually the evidence that convinced me there was something here. And I want to share with you here some highlights of that. It represents a long career, lots of work, a lot of wonderful students, postdocs, fellow professors, and others with whom I worked. And so I want to give credit to them, of course. We produced a lot of information, but in the end of the day, when we sort of sit back, at least I did, sit back and looked at it from a broader perspective, it really had something worthwhile saying, I guess. So we published the China Study, and there we have it. I can't, obviously summarize 58 years worth of work in this 58 minutes. It's kind of hard. So what I'm going to do is I've selected some topics, some observations that I think are pertinent to the question concerning what do we eat and why do we do it? And why have we not known this before? I think the time has come for nutrition to be taken seriously as a science. Now if we get this open here. That's the backyard of our house looking down toward Cornell University, actually. Okay, let me get this right here. Okay, as I say, let's get serious about this and talk about nutrition as if it really means something worth talking about. How many of you have read the China Study, by the way? Quite a few. How many of you have not? Maybe more. I'm always kind of stuck in this rut a little bit. On the one hand, telling people who've already read about this what they already know, and at the same time trying to introduce the topic to those who haven't read. Let me just make a couple of observations here. I did my doctoral work on promoting animal-based protein as a good source of nutrition, if you will. Then got involved, skipping over 2 or 3 years, got involved in coordinating with my senior colleague a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children in the Philippines, where we were intending actually to improve the nutritional life of these poor children, if you will, by making sure they got enough animal protein. That's good. Great. I didn't know which one of the buttons to push. Been out of the lab too long. Thank you. Maybe I can take this off here. Well, let's do it that way. In any case, I was in the Philippines and saw something there that ran counter to what I had been trained in and what I was talking about, and what we all talked about. It was the idea that some children, at least was an impression, some children who consumed the most protein, and the vast majority of the population we thought weren't getting enough, but the few children who consumed the most actually were more prone to get liver cancer. That was exactly the opposite of what I would have thought. So that then led to actually this paper here that was published, as you can see, quite a number of years ago from India in a somewhat obscure journal at the time, where they were also interested in using experimental animals to see what effect protein consumption might have to do with the formation of the same kind of cancer that I thought I was looking at with children, namely liver cancer. And you can see here their hypothesis was that the higher protein, these are animals, incidentally, that had been preconditioned and exposed to a carcinogen. They were destined to get liver cancer. And so there are two groups. The only difference between them was one group was fed to good levels of protein, the 20% of energy, which was said to be the kind of protein that might actually keep that cancer from growing, if you will. The other was fed the 5% protein. As you can see there, the animals fed the 20% protein. They thought they were going to have less cancer, but exactly the opposite happens. These researchers actually didn't believe their own work. And it wasn't until about 25 years later when I was invited to come to India to talk about this that I kind of reminded them they went down the wrong track. But I say that primarily because there is this belief that we've got to get as much protein as we can get. It's the most revered almost of all nutrients. So that observation then led to a series of studies in our laboratory that really turned the world around for me. This was suggesting here that increasing protein associated with increasing cancer. I mean, it's like the most revered of all nutrients actually promoting the most feared of all diseases. Talking about it being something provocative, that was kind of over the top. As I say, a long time ago, that was the basis, in fact, for NIH funding that I got, the first grant I got that actually continued continuously for the next 27 years. And I wanted to know, is this true? And if it's true, how does it work? I mean, in science, you see something, you make an observation, and particularly if it's off the chart a bit, in order to be convinced of it, we kind of have to know how it works. So those two thoughts. Is this true? And basically, how does it work? So I'm going to show you just a few sort of data sets here, if you will, that actually helped me answer that question, number one. But in addition, it was a pretty good model to use to understand how nutrition works, especially how it works in the case of disease formation, in this case, cancer formation. So here we got a little chart. This represents the first 12 weeks in an animal experiment showing what happens during the first 12 weeks after they've been genetically predisposed to get this cancer. So they've all been exposed to a very potent carcinogen, if you will. So when we did what the Indian workers had done, feed them normal levels of protein, 20%, those cancers are growing pretty well that first 12 weeks. In contrast, we give them 5% protein, didn't grow at all. 5% protein was considered to be inadequate, unhealthy. So here we are seeing, the higher levels of protein turning on that cancer. That's really pretty wild, to say the least. Then we got involved in wanting to look at this in a little more detail. So I was interested to see what happens if we switch the diet back and forth. 20%, 5%, 20%, turn it back on again. 5%, turn it off. That information there was pretty striking. We could essentially turn on and turn off that growth of those tumors just by adjusting protein. Think of all things of protein, my gosh. The most important, as I say, of all the nutrients, a lot of us would like to think. So it led to this idea here, and this is kind of a generic principle that now I'm realizing applies to more than just protein and more than this particular cancer. It applies to other nutrients and, let's say, other cancers. So nutrition controls cancer. That's an interesting idea, by the way. Most of us, whether we're in science and to some extent the public too, we tend to think that cancer arises and occurs because of the chemical carcinogens. So those, the chemicals floating around the environment and water and food and so forth, we tend to think that's where our cancer comes from. Sure enough, those chemicals do cause mutations that can lead actually to a cancer event. So we tended to think that's where the burden, that's where the great burden for cancer formation is, coming from chemical carcinogens. Viruses, some ideas along those lines. We know a couple of viruses that play a pretty significant role in this. Genes. Everybody thinks cancer comes from genes. Just ask people, cancer runs in the family. That's genetic. So those are the three main ideas that existed 45, 50 years ago, and I would suggest to a great extent those are the three main causes even today for a lot of people. But the idea that nutrition could control cancer, that was an exciting proposition, because if we knew what kind of cancer, let's say, turned on that, what kind of nutrition turned on that cancer, now the choice is ours. The choice is ours, and all we need to do is put it into play. So that's one thought, nutrition controlling cancer. It was a big idea, actually, as it turned out, with other models. I didn't just use protein and liver cancer. We did some other studies, too. So here's another thought that came up that kind of framed this argument in a sense. This has to do with the role of genes or nutrition in forming cancer. This little schematic here is, I'm starting up at the top there with just sort of drawing some normal cells, the little blue things there, if you will. Let's call them normal cells. The ones on the left, we can create more mutations and get more cancer seeds, let's say in some of those cells, right? With a higher dose of a carcinogen or something causes a genetic change. On the right, we get less. So if the diet stays the same in this situation, and incidentally, we did this many different ways. So this is not just conjecture. This is based on real data. So if you come down the left side here, as I say, everything's the same in this experiment in theory. The ones coming down the left side, more genes, more genetic beginning, more cancer. The ones on the right hand, much less genetic initiation, we might say, less cancer. Fair enough. However, here was the thing that really, well, first off, there's a summary of what I just said. Genes cause cancer. We can say that. You know, everything really starts with genes. For any of you in biology, you know this. Virtually everything starts with genes, a genetic basis, and we tend to therefore conclude that if we can just know those genes, we can know what we're going to get. That's where we make a mistake, a huge mistake. It's not so simple as that. It has to do with something else. In this particular case, look at that. And the one on the left-hand side, headed to get lots of cancer, they're switched to the low-protein diets. The ones on the right getting much less initiation, much less cancer seeds, beginning, if you will. Oh, sorry. There's something cancerous about this remote here. So there's another thought there, by the way, is nutrition controlling, or basically being the veto power, essentially, on whether or not we get the cancer. So what this is suggesting, and now we have lots of data to support this, not just what we had done many, many years ago. Nutrition controls the expression of genes. If we have some mischievous genes, and we all do, that might cause this, that, or something else, what we should keep in mind is our body has an intrinsic capability of controlling these troublesome genes in a lot of cases, if we just know what that nutrition is. Okay, so now here's another thought. I'm just sort of bouncing along here, giving you some more general principles that give the substance to what I have come to believe. You recall I said, I want to know how this works. And so what I meant by that was that in this particular research, I wanted to know, how does protein cause that kind of cancer? Now, one of the things we all tend to assume in science and medicine, and to the public to some extent, we tend to assume that if we know that A causes B, or at least we think it does, A causes B, it operates through a single identifiable mechanism, some kind of biochemical event, maybe an enzyme reaction or something like that. So, and I'll suggest for your thinking, that's the basis for the entire drug industry. In most cases, drugs are developed and synthesized. Those chemicals are made to create a certain kind of response we might desire. And we usually do this after we find out exactly how it works and what the mechanism is. So it's a very linear kind of model, a mechanism, if you get that point. So I was sort of thinking that too. Protein increases cancer. Now, what is the mechanism? So we started looking for mechanisms, and I want to show you first, before I get to that point, this is a timeline representing stages of cancer formation. That's right. There's initiation, that's where the mutation occurs. And then there's a second phase called promotion. That's a much longer period of time, maybe over years in the case of humans. Then finally, there is what we call progression. That's after the cancer maybe has been diagnosed. It's in fairly late stages. But just for the convenience of doing research, we all tended to think this way. You know, it comes in stages, and we gave it some names. But it gave us an opportunity to look to see at these different stages where that mechanism was. So we basically looked in the first stage. And what we found, you can see I call that initiation. We all call it initiation. That's where the mutagenic event occurs, the mutation occurs, involving genes. A chemical comes in and zaps the genes and starts it, okay? That's the general thesis for this kind of thinking. So we looked for the mechanism in that first stage. I thought, well, we'll find something here, and this will tell us why protein increases cancer. All of these, each one of these things I listed here, I'm not going to go into any great detail here, but I should say that as we were looking for the responsible mechanism over a period of about 15 years, each one of those projects, in a sense, became a PhD thesis or more than one. So it was a lot of work, let me just say that. So I could put names on all my graduate students and so forth on who did what. So anyhow, the first thing that we looked for was an enzyme called the mixed function oxidase, MFO. That's an enzyme when a carcinogen comes into the cell, into the body. Most carcinogens get activated. They also get detoxified, actually, but the body likes to get rid of that stuff. But they get activated, so they come along and they're very reactive chemically, and they zap the DNA, being a substance of the genes. And that's the nature of mutations, okay? So what we found was that higher protein diets increase the enzyme synthesis, so you get more zapping going on, more mutations. That was kind of neat. I thought, wow, this is what's happening. Higher protein diets turns on that enzyme. But I should say, just to jump ahead a little bit, that enzyme metabolizes far more than just chemical carcinogens. It metabolizes steroids. It metabolizes even fatty acids. It metabolizes a lot of noxious foreign chemicals. So it's a really much more complicated system than what I'm sort of suggesting here. So but the protein increased the enzyme synthesis. And then, in addition, it increased by another mechanism, I guess. It increased the amount of so-called DNA binding. And that occurs basically by increasing the formation of the product that binds the DNA and slows down, let's say, the repair of that DNA, which the body is capable of doing in most cases. And this high-protein diet does both. It increases the enzyme, it increases the amount that gets and binds to DNA, and sort of turns back to the other thing. But also inhibits the transport of the carcinogen into the cell. Different mechanism. At this point, I'm wondering, which is the one here is counting? We got 4 now, whatever it is. And it changes the structure, the enzyme structure of the enzyme, and that is a fascinating area. Any of you in biochemistry, I think you would know what I'm talking about. Enzymes are big globular molecules, and you twist them and turn them around and stuff like that. It makes a big difference in how active they are. The protein, the dietary protein, rearranged the shape of that enzyme such that it actually did more dirty work in terms of sort of converting the chemical to the cancer. So there we got a bunch of things. I couldn't decide there which one really counts. We're looking for the mechanism. Then we turn to the second stage. Let's look there. This second stage is one we have ultimately learned is reversible. Very exciting concept. Look at the things we looked at here. It lowers natural killer cell activity. That's the name of a fancy name for some part of the immune system that actually attacks the cancer cells, gets rid of them. The high protein diet sort of compromises that activity. So there's another mechanism. High protein diet increases cell replication. That means cells dividing faster. We'd done that way back in 1972 the first time. One of my students did this. And now we know it, and then in 1997, I think it was, we came along and one of my other students observed that the reason that happens because the high protein diet increases the hormone that causes those cells to divide. Another mechanism. See how these mechanisms piling up here? It increases the formation of these oxygen radicals. That tends to be rare reactive stuff that causes the cancer to grow. It causes cells to age, by the way. It causes aging. It actually plays a role in increasing risk for heart disease, too. Another mechanism, really quite different. And the last one, fascinating. I won't get into that, but that's maybe one of the most fascinating of all. The high-protein diet changes the way in which we use calories or energy. I like the word energy. It changes the way in which the calories are distributed in the body, whether it comes and lays down to put a tire around us or makes it a little heavier, or whether it is used to increase our exercise activity. I'm just mentioning that this is an exciting part of the game plan. But in any case, here, all of a sudden I realized I'm giving up. You know, we're doing about this 15 years. I can't find a mechanism. There's no such thing. Finally realized there's no such thing, for the most part, of a single mechanism accounting for the effect of a single nutrient, be it protein or anything else. Now that thought really just, I mean, of all the things I think I observed over the years, I think that may have been one of the most exciting. Because in science, in medicine, we have this very simplistic view that we can take agent X or agent Y or agent Z, and we know exactly where it goes, and it's going to do this, and it's going to actually solve our problem, whatever it is. It's a very reductionist kind of thinking. When in reality, that's not the way nutrition works. And this, incidentally, is one of the reasons that nutrition does not fit within the medical practice paradigm. Medical practice system actually operates with the assumption that we're going to identify a specific chemical to do something we want it to do. When in reality, in food, we got infinite numbers of things operating. Infinite numbers of mechanisms. I'm talking about maybe you could, I don't know how you want to dice this up, maybe millions of different kinds of things going on. And the fascinating part of the story is that it operates like a symphony. All this stuff that looks so different. We keep focusing one thing at a time. That's the wrong approach. Everything is coming together. So I spent maybe too much time on this, but what I wanted to show you here was the substance of my beliefs these days as far as the role of nutrition, especially protein, in the formation of disease is really based on, I would argue, really some really good science. This stuff really got published extensively. So, okay, let's look at, okay, I said that already. We got a symphony going here. Now, here's another one. You know, I kept over the years discovering what my colleagues called heresies. Well, I called them myself heresies. Unbelievable kinds of stuff. When eventually, after some years, you start assembling all these heresies, and you realize they're principles of a new way of thinking, not heresies at all. So in any case, here's one here. This is I mentioned that because this is one of the biggest heresies. The protein we were using was, of all things, the main protein of cow's milk. Boy, that was a dangerous one to even mention. We were using casein. That's what turned things on when it was fed in excess. I said, let's try a couple of plant proteins here, soy and wheat, okay? They didn't do this, even when they're fed to the higher levels. So here's an animal protein turning on cancer, a couple of plant proteins not. That's a big deal. It turned out there was a lot more, it eventuated, I should say, over the years, into that sort of generic kind of statement, and plant proteins do this and animal proteins do that, into really pointing the finger, quite frankly, at plants having the good stuff that does it the right way. A whole bunch of things, and animal stuff, animal foods not having that. That's really where that story eventually led. Okay, and there's another thing here too. I almost, this is like a tree falling in the forest, nobody hears it, this is really what it is. But I would argue till the cows come home, and I know how the cows come home, that casein is the most relevant chemical carcinogen ever identified. when we use the procedures that are basically structured for our determining what's a chemical carcinogen, what's not. Now that one there is really quite a, oh, yeah, I had to stick this in here because there's a little personal story in this too. As I said, it came from the farm, and that's me sitting there a few years ago on the front. Was it 6 or 7 years ago? Not 6 or 7 decades ago, but 6 or 7 years ago. And I was milking cows. That's what we did. So you can imagine, I'm getting this stuff here, especially with casein and running into this. What do I do with that? Do I ignore it? Well, we published it. It was really good stuff. We could fund it and all like that. Of course, we kind of finally had to own up to it. There's something different going on here. That was my PhD dissertation to follow along the same model. I was promoting animal protein consumption and doing it better. And let's see, get that at us quickly. And one of the questions that people ask about this research that I was involved in is that you say casein does this. How do you know? Why do you want to generalize to all animal proteins? For those of you who have followed this story, you'll know what I'm talking about. It turns out that animal proteins as a group tend to behave like each other in a lot of different systems in the biologicals, in the biology. Plant proteins also act differently from animal proteins. And here's one of the best examples. My friend, the late K.K. Carroll, Canada, showed that if he took all these different proteins, plants and animals, to see what effect they had on increasing or decreasing blood cholesterol levels and starting heart disease, all the animal proteins you can see are up there by themselves. Plant proteins are down there, not much overlap. Now, there's some differences between them, of course, but this and a number of other ways of looking at this, animal proteins tend to be like each other and they do their thing. And plant proteins tend to be like each other and they do their thing. So I do generalize. At least taking the risk of generalizing, maybe being wrong in the beginning, but it really turned out now with the additional evidence it really works. Here's another case here where protein got ignored. And this is part of this story, by the way. I'm operating in a realm where we're not supposed to find anything wrong with protein. And in fact, here in 1975, again, my friend, Ken Carroll, published this information here that he showed, for example, comparing different countries, that the amount of breast cancer that occurs in different countries is a function of how much dietary fat there is. See, higher fat, higher breast cancer? That's a nice straight line there. Any of you familiar with this kind of information, you'll recognize that's a really impressive line. And so he concluded, and everybody else concluded, that therefore fat causes breast cancer. End of story. Really wasn't true. To some extent, it does play a role. What that line really shows, and I don't have a chance to get into it, what that really shows is that that line really represents animal food intake, animal protein. There's a very high correlation, for example, between the fat intake and the protein intake in different countries. And there's a lot more to the story, so you just have to take it a little bit on faith in this case. But people didn't want to talk about protein. We're supposed to talk about fat, because in the case of fat, we can take the fat out of milk. We get skim milk. We can eat lean cuts of meat and so forth and so on. No, that stuff is worse by taking out the fat. We end up with a higher concentration of protein. So there's a big story there. Now, here's another sort of thing I find kind of fascinating. I wanted to know which level of protein does what. I mean, we use 20% and we use 5%, pretty far apart. We saw big differences. What's going on, in between? So here's basically doing the experiment again, using different levels of protein. 4, 6, 8, and 10, you can see at the bottom. These are in animals exposed to carcinogen. There already are mutations there. So up to about 10% protein, no cancer growth. Showing, number one, protein is an essential nutrient. So I don't want to condemn protein. It's the amount. It's the amount that's actually being fed, and I'm going to argue the kind of protein that's being fed. So up to about 10% or so, even these animals are in a kind of a dangerous situation of getting cancer when up to that 10%, it's pretty interesting. They don't get cancer. It's only in excess of 10. So now I'm going to have to modify my statement a little bit. Protein, when fed in excess of a certain amount, basically causes the cancer. And not just cancer. I'm going to move on and just jump ahead here and say a lot of different kind of disease outcomes. Heart disease and osteoporosis and all kinds of things. Now, to get to that generalization, and here's something a point I want to make about protein, because I find it's really quite fascinating. First off, we humans, that was a rat study, but the amount of protein that rats need and the amount we need is pretty similar. Some of us are more like rats than others, I guess, in some ways, but in any case, there's a level of protein consumption that most of us are consuming. Let's say we're in a kind of danger zone. You're consuming somewhere protein, it might be causing some problems here for cancer, not just the one I'm talking about, but I'm talking about a whole host of different things. So this is a statement true for all nutrients. Every nutrient it's good. It's essential for some purposes, but there's limits. If it's too low, we get problems. If it's too high, we get problems. So that's what I'm talking about here. There's an ideal level for each nutrient in a sense. And then at the extremes, we want to go there. So I'm taking that curve, and I'm going to show you something new and not show you all the data for that. I'm going to make that chart there. On the left y-axis, I got adverse health effects. Now that might be different cancers. It might be some biomarkers that is going to indicate cancers. It might be heart disease. It might be diabetes. It might be osteoporosis. It might be this. It might be that. So that's on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis is a level of protein that going from that 5 to 20%, as you may have just seen. And I'm heading this thing, dietary protein and general health. What can we learn from that sort of curve that I just showed you from those rat studies? Here's what I think we can say. Now I'm going to give you just a couple of information. Some of you in the area of nutrition, if you've studied this, you'll get this. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this. We have a certain amount of protein being recommended to us. It's been that way for 75 years from the authorities, presumably from the scientific community. We'll show you some of those metrics, those things that get recommended. We have determined the minimum amount of protein to sustain loss of protein. That level is around 5–6% of total energy. That's on average how much we need. If we do an experiment, that's how much protein we need to consume, just to meet the losses. That's fair enough. We call that minimum intake. But then, when this study was first done back in 1943, it wasn't good enough to take this sample of people and say, okay, it's 5–6% here, now let's tell the whole population how you're good to go. They added 2 standard deviations to that, so that in theory it would represent and comprehend the needs of protein, let's say, for 98% of the population. That's statistical sort of an understanding, if you will. It turns out the RDA is around 8, 9, 10%. That has stood the test of time, as developed by the National Academy of Sciences. It's a good number. Science has not challenged that number. It's a really good, scientists are working on this. At that time, they weren't thinking, like I'm thinking these days. They were just looking at the data and saying that 8, 9%, 10% or so is equivalent to the amount of protein. And I would argue, they would argue too, knowing this, that's the ideal level of protein. 8, 9%, 10%, somewhere in that territory, that's the ideal level of protein. And so when we exceed that, that's when we get all these different kinds of diseases. So let's look at this a little more carefully. There's the average intake right now for us, as I showed before. It's around 17, 18% or so. So how can we sort of work this out a little bit in terms of, let's say, some more information? It turns out that if we want the ideal level of protein, minimizes disease formation, promotes health, and so forth and so on, that level of protein is plenty enough coming from plant foods, vegetables, fruits, grains. That's it, period. Now, this is a really big statement, I think, for many, Because historically, ever since protein was discovered back in 1839, most of us tended to think that protein was synonymous with meat, because protein is pretty high in meat. So when people say, "Oh, where do I get my protein from?" they're really saying, "Where do I get my meat from?" When in fact, that's not true. It's true, they get protein from meat. But the point is that if you have a mixed bunch of vegetables and fruits and grains and legumes, you get all the protein you need. You get the ideal level of protein. And so what have we done as a society? 95% of us at least have, let's get this right here, have actually, how did we get up to 17, 18%? Because we started using animal foods. Right now, about 75% of the total protein we consume, on average in this country, comes from animal-based foods. We're getting near to be carnivores in a lot of cases. So here we consume all this extra protein because we thought it was so important. And we thought it also, mistakenly, that it only comes from animal foods. Wrong on both counts. On both accounts. So it's led to a lot of mischief, this idea that are getting the protein. Now, the consequences of that are this. I'm just sort of running through a couple of just things here. When we add, let's say we're at 10%. And somebody says, "Where do I get my protein from?" Okay, you get some meat, you start eating that. And so you increase the total amount of protein. But when we increase the total amount of protein, we're displacing, essentially, a lot of the plant protein we otherwise would be consuming. We're eating steak and pushing the peas to the side, if you will, on the plate. So as we increase this protein intake, because we want to do that, and we also get it from animal-based foods, we're actually displacing plant-based stuff. And of course, let's go a step further. That's what some people do, especially the Atkins crowd, or the Paleo Diet people and people like that. So they're really increasing now their protein a lot. They're really pushing it aside the plate. Now, what does that mean? Just look, you see, so far, you'll think I'm arguing a case just focused on protein. I'm not really. I'm going beyond that. Okay, that's just to tidy up things a little bit here. It turns out, if you look at the nutrient composition of plants and animal-based foods, here are major differences. Plants have lots of antioxidants. In fact, virtually all of the antioxidants we actually consume come from plants. And if there's an important group of nutrients we ought to be consuming until, I won't use that phrase again, the cows come home, but anyhow, if we actually want to really get a good diet, we've got to consume plenty of antioxidants. And that comes from the colored vegetables and grains, like the reds and greens and yellows and the leafy stuff. That's what antioxidants are. And there's hundreds of thousands, or whatever. It's a very large number of them in plants. We've got to get it. That's what prevents cancer, heart disease, and many other things. So that's what plants have complex carbohydrates. That's very good for gastrointestinal health. Vitamins, I'm saying only made in plants, but I'm looking to the strict definition of what a vitamin is. Vitamin D is not a vitamin, it's a hormone. And vitamin A, I'm going to argue too, is not a vitamin either. It's a metabolite of the real vitamin, which is beta-carotene. The antioxidants are present in plants. So anyhow, and then plants and animals have fat and protein, but look at the difference between plant and animals. That's huge. In a nutritional sense, that is huge. Now just stop and think about what I just showed in the last two slides. We push the protein, we get as much as we can. We're pushing the other things aside, so we're getting double whammy. We're suffering the consequences of all the extra protein in the animal food and in the fat as well. And we're subtracting, we're displacing the stuff that really matters. This is something that has not been really acknowledged and recognized in science, in my view. Because for one thing, it's hard. It's really almost impossible to actually ascertain exactly how much of something, how much of an effect is due to, let's say, displacement on one hand, as opposed to increasing on the other. Now, this is another really important point. Okay, gotta move along here. Oh, there's another category of foods that I'd like to mention. I call it processed or processed foods. My colleagues in the UK always say processed foods. But in any case, processed foods. Now, processed foods can be all plant, really. Processed foods are, for one thing, they're made up of refined carbohydrates like white flour and starch from plants, right? And then we might want to put in some of that good oil that we get from plants too, put that all together, and we end up getting a donut or something like that. So we have these processed foods that have any combination of fat, salt, and sugar, the three devils, as we like to say, that might be there in order to get people to buy them. What is that doing? That's doing the same thing as animal-based foods. We're consuming this stuff, displacing the plant-based foods, getting a double whammy, and getting in big trouble. So there's three classes of foods, just three. Look at it this way. Whole plant-based foods, animal-based foods, whole or not, I imagine most of them are going to be pretty whole, or processed foods. Two of them are not good. Two of them are not good. The animal-based foods and the processed foods. The one that matters is the whole plant-based foods. That matters. So let's see what do we learn from that? Here's what we learn. First off, let me just skip through in the interest of time. I'm going to touch this a little bit superficially, I guess. We finally did a study in China. This is the first nationwide study done between the United States and China. We organized that at Cornell University. We got Oxford University and a couple of Chinese academies to do this. We went around the country and we surveyed 130 villages over the whole of the country. We took food samples and urine samples and we asked questions and we analyzed foods, did all kinds of stuff like blood samples. Got a lot of data because I was interested in that time to think about the causation of disease, not due to one thing, one food or one nutrient. I wanted to see this sort of more comprehensive kind of relationship. And so we first learned that the Chinese had these wonderful maps where they had mapped out how much cancers exist in the country for about a dozen different cancers. And they tend to be localized. They tend to be localized like that map there, which I don't mean I got it all covered up. Yeah, see, for breast cancer, they had this information. So we went to China to measure what's so unique about these areas that get the cancer and oppose those that don't. We ended up, as I say, with lots of information. We ended up with about 100,000 correlations that could be used, and not one correlation causing one response. I can assure you that people who say that are wrong. But anyway, we were looking for patterns and how to use these in a sense to ascertain what was going on. And what I was interested in the China study was to see if, in fact, in this human population, we could get information to support or deny what we had been learning in the lab. The China study standing alone did not do the job for me. That was the be-all and end-all of what I happened to know. It was simply an important piece of the puzzle to see if, in fact, what we see in a human population is consistent with what we're seeing in a biological sense in the laboratory. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. There's the practical advice coming from the China study. Consuming whole plant-based foods, less total protein and fat, no animal protein means less chronic degenerative diseases, and it's consistent with the studies we had done. That's sort of the punchline. It's not the China study standalone. For any of you reading any of the stuff, you'll see people say, otherwise it's not. It's a combination of sort of findings. So we get into this, and I'm finally saying by this time, boy, well, I was sorry saying it before that, but we were changing our diet in the family. I mean, you start believing this. It's getting pretty powerful. Just relying on science alone is getting really powerful. And so when finally 1990 came along, as a matter of fact, that's when Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn called me on the phone and said, hey, would you come to a conference? That he was actually working with heart patients and seeing something similar. And Dr. McDougall, John McDougall, and so that's when we got to kind of together and compared notes, and each of us are doing our own thing, coming up more or less the same answer. Finally, in 2002, I set out with my youngest son, Tom, who's now a physician himself, set out with him to see if we could write this up. That became the China study, the so-called China study. And in that effort, I was sort of learning that these principles I just told you about, if you think about them, they really had a lot of application for other diseases and mechanisms and this and that. I wanted to see if we could just tell a story. And so my hypothesis was for the China study was, here's all the evidence, folks. You don't have to believe me. You may not understand it if you're not in science. You don't have to believe me. Just try it. And what turned out is far beyond what I could have ever comprehended. Because when people changed to a whole food, plant-based diet, which is what our data were showing, dramatic effects happen for almost everyone. And I know some of you in this room know the story. And in fact, it's gone on like that, well, let me come back to that thought, but it really has been pretty spectacular. So I've continued to learn by the experiences that people have had with this approach. One of the things that I've learned is going back in the literature and having a look. Has any of this information been there before in the literature? And look at this list here. All these diseases are listed there because there is some peer-reviewed evidence in the scientific literature. In some cases, not a lot, but it's in the right direction. In all these cases, a whole food plant-based diet prevents, suspends, that means suspending further development of. So it prevents, suspends, and or cures all of these. That actually cures them. Wow, this is pretty interesting. We got all kinds of things going on here. It turns out, this is another sort of generalization I like to make. The whole food plant-based diet effect is broad. It just comprehends a whole bunch of ailments and diseases that we might experience. It's also very rapid. When we do this, bang, it just happens so fast. It really happens so fast. A week or two, maybe, getting rid of pain and stuff like this, and diseases start to get reversed, and I'll show you some more of that. The whole food plant-based diet, if it's long-lasting, if the diet is sustained. This is not a treat. It's not like a pill. You take a pill for a couple of weeks and you're going to get things over. No, it's not that. You have to do this and then sustain that behavior change to see these results. And we see a lot of evidence in that in the literature. So here's the bottom line I want to say that I think is really significant. What I'm talking about here is nutrition not just being used in the form of food, of course, nutrition not being used to prevent future diseases, but nutrition being used to actually treat existing disease. Think about that. This is a model. This is a new opportunity for physicians, not just to treat the symptoms, but actually with drugs, but actually use this to reverse disease. There's a typical example. I think many of you know Dr. Esselstyn, he's a Forks Over Knives, very good friend of mine. We lecture together a lot. He started out with a bunch of seriously ill heart patients and followed them over, had 18 of them, followed them over now 27 years, almost 28. And they went from 49 coronary events before the study to 0, except for one person who strayed from the flock, as he says. That's dramatic. So when I got to know Dr. Esselstyn, and I was doing my thing and stuff like this, and then he told me what he's doing, and Dr. McDougall did it, and then there was another gentleman who's in the audience today, Dr. Hans Deal, who was doing it with a Loma Linda group, I think, doing the so-called Coronary Health Improvement Project, CHIP. Maybe you've heard of that. So here we are, a bunch of us out there doing things, getting people, gathering people together, letting them do this, see what happens. It would blow your mind. Just go through that experience. Get involved in one of those kind of studies. Especially if you don't, being young, you might not see a big deal. I think you will. But especially if you get on a little bit in years, you'll see the effect. So here's just one sample of some numbers that I put together, because I just had access to one of our sons is actually doing this, and he's able to take this food. He's made some really tasty food, and it's just delicious. It's really good. He just gives it to people. In this case, he gave it to 16 people, said, hey, here's this here. What happens? Measure before and after. 10 days. 10 days. Body weight, down 5 to 10 pounds in 10 days. Total cholesterol dropping from 196 to 140. That's a pretty big drop when you do it right. LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, the lipoprotein, goes from 118 to 86. That's huge. You know, we can't get those things with drugs. Not like that. Triglycerides, 130/40. Those are the so-called lipid panel or lipid profile that we work with. Look at those changes so fast. And it's not just these clinical measurements. For any of you familiar with any of this thing, it's what people feel. More energetic. 20% of adults in this country are said to have chronic pain, one kind or another. That pain tends to start to go away. Diabetes starts to resolve itself. Heart disease gets cured. I mean, this is really a huge story. So I want to summarize then just quickly, make a couple of comments here. I'm suggesting that what we're learning now is basically echoes from 2,500 years ago. Just look at some of these statements. Hippocrates is the guy who supposedly said we are what we eat. We are. We really are. Aristotle, there's some dispute about this, but he's believed by some writers at least to be the one who said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. He's talking about whole food. I'm talking about symphony. It's the same thing. It's all of it working together. And I could do it, and well, I won't go into that right now. We don't have time. So then Hippocrates came back and said, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Put those three thoughts together. That's pretty interesting. And I suggest we don't have another 2,500 years to get this right. We're really discovering what was known from before with a lot less technical information that they had, obviously, than what we have now. We know it. We know it. And I say this matters, not just for your health and my health and your family's health and our society's health. It really has a big deal. I say the number one cause of death in this country is a misunderstanding of nutrition. It's not even taught in medical schools. In the biomedical research community, of which I'm a part, NIH funded most of my work, Cancer Society a little bit. The NIH has 28 institutes, a Heart Institute, a Cancer Institute, and this and that. There's not one called the Institute of Nutrition. Not one. If the medical people, practitioners are not taught this, if the researchers are not given any money to study this, no wonder people are so confused. We're all prisoners. We're prisoners of the information we're served up by people who want to believe, for starters, that protein is important, yeah. They really want to do that. And so we got big industries that we have to contend with. So look what we do with misunderstanding. We compromise our personal health. Health care costs, big story. Big story. I mean, it's breaking the bank now and ruining companies, and they're sending workers overseas and this and that and everything else. Right now, the health care costs comprise about 70 to 8% of our GDP. It was 5% in 1970. We have seen a 75% increase. You know, we can save all those health care costs just by doing this. That's a no-brainer. That's a no-brainer. But yet the health care reform debate we just had, or the shouting match, or whatever you want to call it, all the people making proposals about, you know, how we should manage our health care system are talking about who's going to pay the future bill. They're not talking about how do you decrease demand. Isn't that a nice idea? Let's not go to the doctor. So inappropriate research, design, and interpretation, I won't get into that. That's pretty significant in my field. I won't. Political policy corruption, big time. I spent about 20 years, actually, on expert panels and things like that, writing national and international policy in the area of diet and health. I saw far more than I wish I had ever seen. That interface between science, if you want to call it science, and policy, what the people get to know, that interface is pretty treacherous territory. And it's largely controlled. I'll just leave it at that. It's controlled by those people and those institutions that want to control what we get to know. It's just that simple. Unnecessary violence, that's something that's been known by many people for quite a while. It's turned them on to this idea, whether it's violence against other sentient beings, animals, of course. I would argue also violence even in the case of wars. You know, so we can go get some oil to fuel our agricultural production. That's a real factor. Now, that's not quite the same. It's changed. The dynamics have changed on that a bit. But we have had tearing down forests and things like that. I think this might be the biggest one right now, not well known. Environmental degradation. I have a friend who just passed away, actually. He was a senior advisor on the environment to the President of the World Bank. Very esteemed fellow. He and his younger colleague at the International Finance Corporation, I followed this because I've lectured at the bank myself with this particular group. They have been wrestling with this idea that the chief cause of global warming is not just all the CO2 that's getting up there. The chief cause of global warming, according to their analysis, is raising livestock. More than 51% of global warming being attributed to that. That's their figures. That's pretty striking. So if we decide, you know, we're going to eat the right kind of food so we can get healthy, we can have the consequences that are huge. The loss of soil by intensive agriculture. They're sucking up all the great aquifer water. We're contaminating our water supplies. A lot of the environmental problems that are upon us now, really, if you look at the data, I mean, this is controversial. I know this is controversial. We can't get exact numbers on this, but what is quite clear is that the effect is huge. If we were to stop just promoting livestock-based agriculture, we get a lot of benefit in return for that. So those 3 books that I'm involved with, China Study, that second one in the whole just came out last May, where I'm attempting to try to explain having a new way of thinking about nutrition. At least for me. I mean, people might want to argue about it, whatever, but when I think of this concept of whole things working together, rather than always taking little pieces out, making a drug or doing this or that, when I think of the whole and really understanding it, it has so much meaning. And simultaneously can actually lead to some really remarkable solutions. Oh, that last one was, okay, never mind, finish it. So thank you very much. I'll take your questions.
On behalf of Pepperdine University, Dr. Campbell, we'd like to offer you this. And there's no meat products in there, I don't think. Okay. Just to let you know, there is a book signing that will be down in the bookstore starting in just a few minutes. If you don't know where that is, if you're from off campus, there are some signs and some arrows pointing down a couple of some very small flights of stairs to the bookstore. And we invite you all to come to there. Dr. Campbell will be signing books for a little while. Thank you very much. Let's please thank him again for being here.